I'm here today with Terry Catasús Jennings and Rosita Stevens-Holsey, the authors of a new book titled Pauli Murray, The Life of a Pioneering Feminist and Civil Rights Activist. Rosita is one of Pauli Murray's nieces and an ambassador for the Pauli Murray family. She feels it's an honor to be a part of enhancing and promoting her aunt's legacy and her responsibility as a family member to do so. Rosita lives outside of Washington, D.C., and you can learn more at PauliMurrayCenter.com. That's PauliMurrayCenter.com. Terry came to the United States with her family after fleeing Cuba after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Today, Terry resides in Reston, Virginia with her family. She's the author of the upcoming picture book, La Casita de Esperanza, The Little House of Hope, and of the Definitely Dominguita chapter book series. You can learn more about Terry at terrycjennings.com. So thank you both for joining us. It's really a pleasure to learn more about you and about the Pauli Murray book that you've written. But maybe to get started, you can just tell us a little bit about your background and what I briefly touched on. Rosita, would you like to start first?
Certainly. I just retired as a teacher for Prince George's County, Maryland. And before that, I spent 22 years working with people with disabilities. I began my career as a teacher in New York State and followed that by being a systems engineer for IBM. Some of my greatest thrills were when I went to Germany for a vacation and stayed 10 years. So during that time, I was able to get a position with the Department of Defense, first as a teacher and then as a coordinator of minority studies. So I've had quite a different kind of background. And now my focus is on enhancing the legacy of my aunt, Pauli Murray.
Wow, very cool. Very cool. So I know from our previous conversation that Terry and I both share some experience with AT&T many years ago. But Terry, would you like to tell us more?
Sure. And you said that, and I am Cuban and came to the United States right after the Bay of Pigs in 1961. I had always wanted to be a writer because I'm a big reader. And but at some point in high school, there was a teacher that was not very kind to me as far as writing and being Cuban and all that. And I got my little feelings hurt. And so I said, I don't want to be with you in any creative writing class anymore. So I got out of there. And actually my math teacher, and actually she was the leader of the Christian youth at the school, she was very, very nice to me. And I majored in math because she was so nice to me. And I ended up working for the phone company until my children were born. So I really didn't go into writing, and probably I wouldn't have, because writing is not a secure career. An immigrant can't have, you have to have a good job that puts food on the table. But when I was 50, by that time I was, done with everything. I had volunteered as much as I wanted, as I could volunteer. My kids were in high school and college. I said, I'm going to give that writing a chance. And I kept saying, okay, I'm going to see if I can do this. And I wrote, and then I said, well, I'm going to see if I can get paid for it. And I did. So there you go. I started doing little things, and it's built up to where I am now.
Very cool. Very cool. So
and thank you for having us. This is wonderful.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. When I heard about your book, I said, okay, well, we've got to do, an interview, because, Pauli Murray was really quite an amazing individual. I was so glad that you guys wrote a book about her. So, but before we get into that, Terry, you've written several previous books too. Can you tell folks just a little about those?
Yeah, I actually started writing educational text. And in educational books, I wrote for the Smithsonian. Then I wrote science-based, creative nonfiction books, like Gopher to the Rescue, about the eruption of Mount St. Helens, all for children though.
Hmm.
And I have written in newspapers and magazines, but actually the first thing I ever wrote was published by the Washington Post, and it was published in 3 weeks. I submitted it 3 weeks later. They published it. It was about teaching my daughter to write. I mean, to drive. So, you know, it was fun. It was wonderful. And it gave me the impetus to try to keep on going. But my first fiction was, like you said, the Definitely Dominguita series last year. And it is about a Cuban-American third grader who fights bullies and solves mysteries while pretending to be characters in the classics like Don Quixote and Treasure Island and Sherlock Holmes. And then, you know, I've done a lot of nonfiction as well. Some of it has been work for hire that nobody ever knows that I did it. And some of it, like the women's liberation movement, which was what got me into learning about Pauli Murray, was a great book, a fun book to write. So yeah, so now, like you said, the Little House of Hope is coming out in May, on May 17th. So I'm really excited about that too. So this has been a banner year from 2021. The pandemic was good to me.
Very good. Excellent. Excellent. So Rosita, this is your first book, but I know you've been involved in disseminating your aunt's legacy. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work?
Well, I had a very busy February and March of this year because of Black History Month and Women's History Month. During Black History Month, I did a radio show, which of course was on Zoom, through the Episcopal Church. It's a brand new series that they're doing, which each quarter, persons of color who have written a book or edited a book are invited to come in and speak about the book. So I got the opportunity to do that for Black History Month. And also, I live in a complex where there are about 1,000 residents, and I was asked to do an interview. So I had a full-page article about Pauli Murray, and I was very surprised that the editor of the paper had actually met my aunt and had a first edition book signed by Pauli, that she was very proud of. Usually people have never heard of her. So that was quite exciting, and she was quite enthusiastic. And I'm working with the Pauli Murray Center. I'm actually a board member there. So I'm always involved in the things that they're doing to promote Pauli Murray. Also, I'm quite excited that we're working for the city of Baltimore to give us permission to place a statue of Aunt Pauli in Baltimore that would replace where a statue of a Confederate person had been. So that has been quite exciting, and I'm working with the Bishop of Maryland and the president of the Union of Black Episcopalians. And that's been a long-term thing, and of course will be a long-term thing because we'll have to raise money for this statue and what have you.
That's thrilling, though.
Yeah, as a part of Black History, Women's History Month, I also was interviewed for an article in the National Women's History Alliance magazine. And they do very exciting work. They actually began in 1980, and that organization was responsible for getting the president to announce the first Women's History Day. And then that expanded to National Women's History Week, and now it's National Women's History Month. So that was also quite exciting. And I have a lot of things planned for the future that I won't take up time telling people, but I have my first entree at 80 into social media, and all of the things that I'm doing or involve Pauli Murray are on preserving Pauli Murray.
Wow.
So hopefully you and some of your listeners might check us out.
Yes, absolutely. That Preserving Pauli Murray is a website, or is that on Facebook or somewhere
The
else?
website should be ready by the end of the month,
Okay.
but Preserving Pauli Murray is both my Gmail, my Facebook, and my Instagram.
Oh, wonderful. Very cool.
Yeah,
Well, congratulations on launching all of that.
thank you.
So I mentioned the name of the book is Pauli Murray, The Life of a Pioneering Feminist and Civil Rights Activist. Can you talk about how this book came about? Either one of you can take it, whichever you prefer.
Okay, I think I'll go ahead and start. I met Pauli when while I was researching a book called The Women's Liberation Movement from 1960 to 1990, and she was absolutely pivotal in getting rights for women, in particular equal pay for equal work. And so I was, being a writer at that time. I will call myself a writer at that time already. And I was always looking for, okay, what's the next idea? And there were a couple of women in that book that I started following. And I began to read about Pauli, and the more I read, the better, the more that I loved her. And I found a kindred spirit when I read about her, her need for fairness, and her, being so prickly as she was, and sometimes getting in trouble for being prickly. And I noticed that there weren't very many books about her. She had an autobiography, so she was very easy to follow and get to know. But there weren't very many other books about her, and they were huge books. The ones that were there were very comprehensive because she did so much. But the more important thing was there was nothing for children. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a lack that needed to be remedied. So when I met Rosita, I just felt like I had been blessed, like something came from above and said, yes, this project can go on. And so we met. I tried, at a play at Howard University, and I was stalking the members of the family, and so we started working. So Rosita, if you want to say that, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about how we actually collaborate.
Yes, we're having a play about Pauli that had been brought by the Pauli Murray Center to Howard, called To Buy the Sons, The Challenge of Pauli Murray. And I happened to be sitting up in the family section, and Terry came by looking for a family member to meet. And I knew as soon as we met, there seemed to be a connection. She was so open and so enthusiastic about Pauli. And so we talked, and she found out that I was an elementary school educator and had also thought about writing. And so we met, spent the day together and talked. And then Terry has a lovely home on the Rappahannock. And so we went down there and used that sort of like a writer's colony for about a week. And we worked almost from dawn to dusk every day.
Wow.
And planned out an outline and what have you, and worked on that. And then with the pandemic and all, or with not living, I live about 50 miles from her in Maryland. We did a lot on Zoom and calling back and forth and what have you. And then we got the product.
Yeah. What was cool was, we did, like Rosita said, we did an outline, we did a vision of what we wanted to do. And we combined our research because Rosita had been trying to lift up Pauli Murray. So she had already, even though Pauli Murray wrote a lot for other people, she didn't, communicate a lot to her family. And So Rosita had done a lot of this research, and so we combined our research. But one thing that was really cool was while we were sitting there on the porch, on the steps of the porch, by the river, she would call her cousins and say, because we had holes in our outline. Okay, what do we need here? What do we need here? And she would call cousins, and it was like I was a fly on the wall listening to these conversations, and it was such a close connection. It was so wonderful. And we had a great time. And I must say that we did have a glass of wine every night after we finished. We rewarded ourselves every night.
Good, good. Well, that's important. So, obviously our audience has got a lot of writers. How did you go through the process of getting the book published?
Oh, boy. Well, I would say I was very lucky because Terry is an established writer. And I believe for probably about 10 years at least, she had an agent, and they were willing to take me on. We thought that would work well. Terry had published quite a few books through her. And so it was really a gift horse that she did. We were very excited about the process, and in the beginning, we didn't get any nibbles, so the book sort of sat on the shelf. But eventually, it was picked up, and so we were able to get it published.
Now, one interesting thing is that we went through many iterations. One of them was many of them were in prose. But that didn't seem to be working for me. And so I tried it in verse. And so that was what Rosita and I agreed was the better way to do it. And we sent that off to Natalie, our agent. And Natalie says novels in verse don't, biographies in verse won't sell. So let's cut this back. Let's not make it in verse. So we actually took our verse novel and made it into very choppy prose, which was awful, absolutely awful. But that was what we submitted, and it did sit on the shelf, like Rosita said. But the editor at Little B saw something, and she said, if you would like, I love what they're saying. I don't love the way they're saying it. If you have anything else. If they're willing to rewrite. So Natalie shot off, the first 10 pages of the verse novel, and she said, yep, that's it.
Oh my goodness, that's so funny.
Yeah, so it was.
You can't predict these things, right?
Right. Natalie comes back and she says, oh, well. So anyway, we got it. It was originally scheduled to be published in November 2022. So out in the future from now. And we worked very quickly with the editor, Courtney Fahey, at the time, and she was wonderful. She's no longer with Little B, but she was great. And we, I think the book was through second, we did the developmental edits, and then the first revision and the second revision, and then we got our contract. And so I think that was by July. And by that time, they decided to move it up to January. And it actually ended up publishing in February because of the problems of the shipping. But it has been very quick, and it was very gratifying. But I think everybody realizes that we have to get the word out about Pauli Murray. There's no way that she should continue to be in the dark. So I was very grateful that they brought it up.
Well, I mean, that's kind of amazing in today's environment. I mean, I've heard lots of books recently that have been delayed many months from what they were originally planned. This is the first that I've heard of recent books that got pulled up by 6 months or more. That's pretty unique.
11 months.
11 months. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was the since we do have a lot of writers here, the fire drill that we had to go through to get the permissions for all the, this is nonfiction. You have to get permission for every word that you quote, and you have to get permission for all the pictures, and we were very grateful that Rosita was able to get her family to allow us to use the many pictures that we have in the book, and to allow us to quote from Pauli's works. But, I don't know, we had about, I would say, more than 300 things that we had to have permissions for.
Wow.
And that was a fire drill. That was one of those things that in the 11 months we would have been able to do with perhaps more time and less stress. But that was a very busy time for us.
Yeah, kind of a heroic effort.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what? But we do have to be very grateful to Natalie Lacasselle from Irene Goodman Literary. She took on that permission thing. That's her thing. She loves that. And she took it on and she really helped us out.
Wow. So can you say a little bit about Pauli's faith background?
Rosita, you want to go ahead with that?
Sure. Well, she had always been an Episcopalian since a child. Her two aunts, whom she lived in the same home with, along with her grandparents, were founding members of a little Episcopal church where they worshiped. And so she had been exposed to the church for many years. Then one of those aunts married an Episcopal priest, and she spent a lot of time with them helping out and what have you. Her Aunt Sally moved to Crone, Maryland, which is very close to where I live, to this area where there was a small Episcopal church, and her husband had three little churches that he rotated between. And Aunt Pauli also used to come up during the summers and stay with them. There was an interesting thing that happened to her when she was about 18. She was blessed by Bishop Henry Beard Delaney, the first Black suffragan bishop of the Episcopal Church. And he had told Pauli that she was a child of destiny. And she always remembered that. And also her Aunt Pauline also reminded her of that. So this was early on in her life. But as it would be, there were many other paths which she followed before she actually formally became interested in the priesthood. She actually really wanted to be a writer. And that was what she had hoped to do by going to college and, learning better how to write.
Well, she had this one quote that I just love, which was one person plus one typewriter makes a movement. That's shows great optimism and great determination just in and of itself. Can you tell us a little bit about that aspect of her?
Yeah, she was way ahead of the civil rights movement. And she believed in the power of her words. At one point, she, as a young woman, she spent time. She had a friend who started writing. She would write letters to politicians, and they would answer. And Pauli took that as an example. And so she started. That was a quote that she had to her mentor at Howard Law, Caroline Ware. And Caroline Ware was a white woman who could not be a professor at any other law school because she was a woman. So she was a professor at a Black university. So anyway, that was her then, and they had a very deep connection. But what Pauli did was to write, whenever she saw something, she would write an article about it, or she would write a letter to the editor. She also wrote Truth to Power. And she was very upset with President Roosevelt because President Roosevelt did not do anything to stop lynching. She felt that he could have tried to pass laws, gotten Congress to pass laws to stop lynching, and she felt that Southern votes were more important to him than the fate of her countrymen, of her race. So she wrote him, and she included a copy to Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor answered, and Eleanor said, "Don't, you need to be patient." And Pauli said, "Like hell," and not in so many words, but they became fast friends. Eleanor one time crossed a picket line in D.C. when there was a movie about Abraham Lincoln, and Black people were not permitted to go. And she wrote they picketed, and she wrote how unfair that was. And Eleanor invited her to tea, and they talked. They became fast friends. She would be invited to Val Kill, and she would be invited to the White House. She was, Aunt Pauline and Aunt Sally were invited to the White House, or to be with Mrs. Roosevelt. So, but Mrs. Roosevelt wrote a column called My Day, and in it she often amplified what Pauli was saying. And she sometimes asked people in the administration to change things. But one of the things that Pauli did was to make sure, her writings made Blacks feel like, hey, we're not alone. Yes, this is unjust, because she was saying the way we're being treated is unjust. And they would say, yeah, somebody's listening. Somebody knows what we're going through. And through her writing, she was able to do an awful whole lot to right an awful whole lot of wrongs. So, that was the best.
The preeminent activist blogger before it was blogging, right? I mean,
she was a burr in everybody's saddle.
Well,
she would use poetry, short stories, and her writings to express her feelings or her outrage. And I think today, some of the things she wrote some of the things she wrote back then would be similar to the op-eds that are written today in the newspaper.
Sure. I can totally see that. Now, she was also involved in the National Organization for Women. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, she was. It was a very interesting story, because she didn't mean it to happen this way. But, Pauli saw the evolution of the fight over Jim Crow laws that the NAACP took, fighting. They would take one facility, and they would fight to make sure that facility was equal and that kind of stuff. So she had seen that. And eventually the NAACP brought Brown versus Board of Education, and that desegregated schools. So when she was in Yale, she was a student in Yale getting her doctorate, and she was asked to speak before the National Congress of Women, and the National Congress of Women, or Council for Women. She was asked to speak before them, and what she said was that by that time, the 1964 Civil Rights Act had happened. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was formed because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and that was supposed to adjudicate any complaints that anyone brought about discrimination in the workplace. Well, what they were doing was taking Black men's complaints, which totally they should have, but they did not take any of the women's complaints, and they did not adjudicate them. They didn't give them any worth. The guy, actually, it was a Roosevelt that was in charge of the EEOC, and they kind of laughed at women's complaints. And what Pauli said in that speech was, hey, women should not be afraid to form an organization to fight for their rights. So the next morning in the New York Times is this thing that says Yale professor, which she was not yet, and his Yale professor advocates for women, for an organization for women. And, it wasn't exactly what she meant. But Betty Friedan saw that article, and she called Pauli Murray. And they talked. They found, again, kindred spirits. And Pauli introduced her to a group of women that Friedan ended up calling the Underground Network of Women in Washington. So these were government workers, women who had reached positions of power, although albeit behind the scenes, most of them, but they had been part of the President's Commission on the Status of Women. That's how they had all come together earlier, and they had continued to stay in touch. And of course, Pauli was at the apex of that group because she was the ultimate communicator. She was the blogger, like what we were saying. So when Betty Friedan found her, and through her, those people, they started collaborating, and they they all happened to go to a conference where the EOC was being discussed. And so they tried to bring up their grievances, and the men would not even allow them to bring it up, put it on the agenda. And they said, okay, everybody put $5 down. All the women that were there put $5 down. They created the National Organization for Women to bring women to equality with men. And they did. That's what they began to take to court employers that were discriminating against women, and that started the ball rolling. That didn't take us as long because then once they did, then the EEOC started paying attention.
Wow, what an impressive person, just from the standpoint of making things happen.
Yeah, she's a butterfly effect. When she started wiggling her wings, everybody paid attention.
Wow. Now, another, interesting aspect of her were struggles with gender identity. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I can say as a family member that she had never felt comfortable telling us about her issues and her concerns and her confusion about gender, excuse me, any more than she had basically with the public. She and I once had an discussion about the fact that she had married. I didn't have any idea that she had married, but she had actually married and lived with her husband a very brief time. But that was more of a survival relationship because they both were knew each other during the Great Depression. And so they combined their resources to be together. But now that I have actually done research and read books about her, I realized that she did suffer quite a bit because of it. And the thing that really sticks in my mind is that all of her life, she was in a situation where she could not feel comfortable really discussing how she felt about her identity. And there, you have to remember at that time, there wasn't GLAAD, there wasn't Pride, there weren't, people just didn't speak in the open about those kinds of things. So in order to survive, she had already survived discrimination because of race, discrimination because of gender, and then to add another issue that might have been frowned upon, she did not do it. I did find out in my oral history with my oldest cousin, who is still alive, that the weekend before she died, she and my aunt, the last remaining sibling, went to Pittsburgh to visit with her because they knew how ill she was with pancreatic cancer, having no idea that really she was basically almost on her deathbed. Um, they spent the weekend and talked, and Aunt Pauli did share with them at that time that she had loved a woman, and she talked a little bit about her identity, some people might say crisis, throughout her life. And then she actually died as my aunt and her daughter were coming back to Washington. So she was really
Wow.
ill. She may have foreseen that she didn't have long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It sounds like it. Wow. So
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier that a lot of folks don't, or a lot of folks are not aware of what Pauli actually wrote herself. Would you like to share a little bit about that?
Well, the first long thing, as I mentioned, she had written short stories and poetry. And actually, during many of the times when she did not have a steady job or a lot of money, she would actually write columns, and she would maybe get $50, $75 for a poem or a column. But of course, it wasn't a steady amount, and she could not live on that. But when she was in college, she actually had the idea of writing a story about our family, the ancestors. And unlike what we would do today, when Terry and I could go to the internet or use the computer to access a lot of information, she actually came to Washington and spent a couple of years, I think about 3 years, at the National Archives, going through the books and the records of our family and going back to find out, you know, our lineage and things of that nature. But she was also lucky because her grandfather had been writing journals for years. And so quite a bit of the family history was included in those journals. And so her first regular book, or full book, was Proud Shoes in 1956. And that book has been republished, but that was her first major book. And then she wrote a book called Song in a Weary Throat, and that was more of an autobiography of her life. She died just almost at the very end of her, the manuscript, but luckily the book was finished and edited and was published several years after her death. And then her poetry had been combined into a book called Dark Testament, which was also the name of a major poem. And I did not know until Terry and I were doing research that Dark Testament had been used at Martin Luther King's funeral.
Wow. Wow.
And the interesting thing was that Pauli did not know either
Yes.
that it had been used at the funeral until someone started asking who it was, where this wonderful poem, where was it? And it came out in the Seattle Intelligencer that the gentleman did the research and found out that it was a Pauli Murray poem. And then they made all her poems into a book. She also did some writings. Proud Shoes was the history of her family, but it was also the history of the Black race in the United States, because that was something when she was in high school and when she was in college, there wasn't anything to tell Black people their history. They were always the cause of the Civil War and nothing more. And so she wanted to straighten that out. And so that was the other part of that she included in Proud Shoes. But then she also did something called States Laws on Race and Color. And she did that for the for the Methodist women And they had settlement homes that they wanted to make sure that they could serve Black people, or, or if they couldn't, how they could, how they could get around it. So Pauli, they asked her to, do a little pamphlet on race on different states, or that different, I think it was just on states that they asked her to do. Well, it ended up being 700 pages. And it was every law on color, on every Jim Crow law in every state, every town, every municipality. And then what happened was that the lawyers that were fighting, the NAACP lawyers that were fighting against Jim Crow, could use this rather than having to research on every case. Hey, they go to Pauli Murray's book and they get it.
Wow.
The other very consequential thing that she did was a treatise called Jane Crow and the Law. And it stated how gender discrimination was just the other side of the coin of race discrimination. And that was something that, you say, oh, of course it is. Yeah. But nobody had ever said that before. And she worked on that with Mary Eastman. And that was, I think, what the seeds of that paper was what turned the tide to include women as a protected category in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So her writing was so influential.
I guess.
What
an amazing person. My goodness. To do all that she did in that day and age. When as you said, both women and, African Americans were just like, so second class. I mean, compared to, white men.
What was interesting about this second class thing, even in the 1963, and you would think that if you have experienced discrimination, that you do not wish that on anybody else. But in the 1963 Civil March on Washington, Rosa Parks was made to walk with the women. She was not allowed to walk with Dr. King, or she was not allowed on the dais. And to me, that is, the crowning blow. And no wonder Pauli Murray didn't get credit for having her work used in Brown versus Board of Education, exactly. Because they just didn't think that women had any worth.
Wow.
No men, not just Black men. I don't want to cast any aspersions into a particular group. It was God and everybody. And yeah.
So what would each of you say would be like the one thing that you want readers to take away from the book?
I would hope that people would understand that Aunt Pauli was a very humble human being, but that she was interested in all human beings being treated fairly, equitably, and with respect. And she got so much pushback and had so many obstacles and brick walls that she had to push through. But that if she, as one person, could do that, anybody should, just work on their dream, not give up when they're faced with obstacles, and hopefully be very inspired by the life she lived.
I totally agree with what Rosita says. I keep coming back to her emphasis on the 14th Amendment, the fact that there can be no unfair loss. To her, fairness was the most important thing in her life, that everyone has to be treated equally before the law. And I hope that readers of this book take that message and understand that the 14th Amendment has to be protected. And the only way to protect the 14th Amendment is to vote for people who will protect the rights of everyone, that will not allow any unfair laws to be done. So I'm really afraid right now for everything that's happening along the lines of voting rights. But regardless of how difficult it becomes to vote, everyone needs to vote for the people that will represent their needs and that will make legislation that will help them be better and protect the 14th Amendment at all costs. Because in the end, when you come to all these things, all of these things get solved by understanding whether a law is fair or not. Mm-hmm. And I think that's her legacy, and I hope that's the takeaway from that. Go out and vote.
Amen to all of that. So if we could for a moment, just looking forward, can you each tell us a little bit about, kind of future things going on that we should watch for?
Well, we actually have a picture book that we finished, and it's being shopped around with hopes of finding a publisher. And we will certainly let you know when that happens. We're hopeful. And I will continue my work with enhancing Pauli Murray's legacy for the foreseeable future.
And from this project, we learned an awful whole lot about the 14th Amendment and about the fact that young readers don't have that understanding. So we just submitted a book to our agent. Another is kind of a picture book, for older readers, middle grade, high school. But it may be called, if I had to come up with a title, it might be called "It Took More Than the Emancipation Proclamation," which shows all the dance between one step forward, two step backwards every time that there was a step forward in rights in human rights. There was a backlash from the white majority, and now becoming the white minority. So I hope it's a book about the need to vote. And we kind of said in the bottom, this could be expanded into a series which could cover Reconstruction, the history of Reconstruction, the history of the Electoral College, and the history of the Supreme Court, how the decisions of the Supreme Court have affected human rights. So it's all about social justice and voting and human rights. But again, that's I'm not real sure our agent has seen that yet. She has it, but I don't know that she has seen. I mean, she knows about it, and we've the first book she's seen, flashes of. So, but yeah, I'm real hopeful about that, because you need to know the history before you can, and you need to understand before you realize what rights have been taken away from you and how easy it is to lose rights, not just as a person of color, but also as a woman. It was very difficult to get to all these, to have the rights that we enjoy now, and we should not allow them to be taken away.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, congratulations to you all for doing this work.
Wait a minute.
Oh.
I forgot my book, My Little House of Hope. That's coming out on May 17th. Both in English and in Spanish, May 17th. So don't forget.
Well, please keep us posted on all of the upcoming work. And, again, the title of the new book that we've been talking about is Pauli Murray, The Life of a Pioneering Feminist and Civil Rights Activist. And you can learn more at paulymurraycenter.com and terrycjennings.com. So thank you all so much for all this fine work. It really has been wonderful learning about it, and I really wish you the best in getting the word out further.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much for having us.
Yes.
My pleasure. Absolutely.
All right.